Welcome to the Pheno Flicks.
Welcome to the next episode of Pheno Flicks. Today we're going to go over LionsMane, or Hericium arenaceus. So, just getting started, this specific strain of LionsMane, as we like to call HE-cns, it was developed by Leighton Banks, who is a mysterious mushroom man from the Appalachians. Eric is good at finding these mysterious mushroom people. They became friends, and he said that he had this strain of LionsMane that he cloned from the wild, and it works really well. So, eventually he left the mushroom industry, but he was nice enough to gift us his knowledge and his strains. And today we are now cultivating HE-cns. And it's one of the two biggest cultivated LionsMane strains in the States. The other one, I believe, is HE-pow. That's a little bit about where this strain came from, just from the mountains of Maine, or the hills as some like to call them. First off, we're just going to start talking about how we set up our cryo vials, and this is just our long-term storage in order to prevent strain degradation. So with our current cryo storage protocol, we can store our strains for up to about 2 to 3 years comfortably, and then after that they start getting a little iffy. And our current strain preservation protocol includes getting just an agar dish, and instead of leaving it bare and allowing the mycelium to grow and take over the plate, we're going to pour rye berries, is what we're using currently, all along that plate, just kind of in a nice little circle. Then we're just going to let the plate incubate, grow, take over these rye berries, and you want to make sure that the rye berries are fully colonized before we look to preserve them. And so what that means is just the mycelium will fully cover the rye berry and then even start to move on a little bit. And at this point, you can deem that, okay, it's moving on from the rye berry, so that means it's probably infected the inside of it. I don't want to keep it too long or it'll just turn the rye berry into mush and we're going to lose our cryoprotectant properties that the berry provides for us. So just as soon as it starts leaving that berry, we're going to come back, and now we want to take these rye berries and toss them into our cryoprotectant solution. So we have cryo vials, just plastic vials anywhere you look. That's pretty sure what they're called. And we fill those up with about 3 mils of water and glycerol at 10%. We're just going by volume on that. So, if you have 3 milliliters of total solution, then you're going to have 0.3 milliliters of that glycerol inside of your solution. And this is 10%, which based off of research papers has shown to be the most effective amount of glycerol to provide proper cryoprotectancy. So we have our grain berry, we have our vial filled with our glycerol solution. All you do is simply sterilize whatever tool you're using, grab that rye berry or grain, toss it into the vial, and you just want to make sure that the grains aren't floating, but that there is full submersion going on with that grain. You can give them a little shake. Some of them float, but most of them will just go nicely down to the bottom. After it's in there, you just seal it up, toss it in your cryo freezer at negative 80 degrees Celsius, and it's waiting to be used for another day. When we are ready to actually start growing our strain, we will simply grab our desired vial out of the cryo freezer, and we will let it thaw inside of a warm water bath just at 30 degrees Celsius, nothing crazy, just nice kind of room temperature. And this just speeds up the thawing process to allow ice crystals to not exist in a state of forming and reforming for too long, but just push past and go straight all back into a liquid solution. From here, we will get our bare Petri plate. And the Petri plate that we'll be using, or agar that we are going to be using, is a malt yeast agar with charcoal inside of that plate. The charcoal, we're going to get back to that later. There is a reason that we like to do it for LionsMane. But anyway, it's mainly a malt yeast agar that we are using. So we have our fresh Petri plate and we have our cryo vial with our myceliated grains. You're just gonna sterilize your tool, grab that grain and toss it right on the middle of the plate. And now we are ready to start our agar incubation stage. That grain is gonna be sitting nice in the middle of our plate, and it's LionsMane grows a very wispy, kind of clear mycelium. It doesn't grow this nice white fluffiness like the Pheno, and like oyster mushrooms out there, they almost grow a mat or have thicker threads that you can actually see taking over the plate. LionsMane is a lot more wispy. It's very clear, so that's why I mentioned that we like to use the charcoal plates, because without the charcoal plate, it's gonna be very hard to see your leading edge of your mycelium. And just allowing that black and white contrast, we can almost start to see these invisible threads that are crawling across the plate. And that's just gonna continue and persist for about a week and a half to 2 weeks until it hits the edge of that plate. You might get we're going from grain to agar, so you might have an initial little bit of lag time. And this is just where the mycelium's now in a new environment, new media to eat, so it just has to develop, change up its enzymes. So yes, it grows continuously, nice and fluffy for about 1.5 to 2 weeks. And in that initial time period, there's a little bit of lag time for the mycelium to actually go onto the plate and outside of the grain. And during that time period, we like to keep it inside of our flow hood, because the flow hood stays at about 80 to 85 degrees ambient temperature. So there's a dog. Wait! So as it's getting onto the plate, we like to keep it in the flow hood, because our flow hood is about 80 to 85 degrees. This just is more of an incubation temperature and helps that piece of grain and mycelium establish itself onto the plate. And once it's done that, we're welcome to move it around and whatnot. So it'll usually stay in the flow hood for over the weekend, or if you did it at the beginning of the week, we'll just bag it up and get it all sealed and into incubation come the end of that week. So, there are 3 to 5 days in our flow hood incubating, not that much growth, just some little wisps coming out. Tossed in the incubation, all sealed up, and incubation is at about 65 to 70 degrees. And inside of here, it's just gonna keep taking over that plate, and we just like to monitor it and catch it about 1 centimeter away from the edge of the plate. Being, as we've mentioned before, if it hits that edge of the plate, it's no longer in rapid cell division stage, and it's more looking just to absorb nutrients and get maybe a little denser and happier inside of that Petri plate. Once it hits that outer edge, it won't really start to fluffen up and densen up all around the plate. Instead, you'll start maybe getting some type of primordia formations, just dense fluff clusters are kind of all around the plate. And as you can see on this one, our plate right here is a little on the older side, so it's got that fluff going all around, and in the middle, it's even started to form a fruiting body. Granted, it's gonna be a very tiny fruiting body at that, but LionsMane is so reactive that it will try to fruit on your plate. We've still used plates like this, just as long as you grab from the outer edge and not a section that's, got a big primordia on it or an actual fruiting body. So when we have our leading edge and we're ready to cut and make one of our grain bags, first we make a 4-pound grain master. And in order to make those 4-pound grain masters, we will get this plate, and on that leading edge, we will take cuttings going all around the leading edge. And these cuttings are just squares that are about 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. And we just do that falling all around the outside. If we're looking just to make a bunch of 4-pound G1 masters, we'll just do 2 cuttings per 4-pound master bag, one on the front, one on the back of the bag. And if we're, maybe a little more rushed for an order and we need to get it out there quicker, then we'll do 4 cuttings, so 4 cubes, front, back, and the sides of that 4-pound grain master. Once inside of that grain master, we're still just gonna get a little bit of lag time to start with. You'll just maybe see your agar cube sitting there, and some little white threads and wisps will start coming out. And so for about the first week, we're just gonna get this almost invisible spread of mycelium that's going across that bag. So it's gonna grow nice and radially. We'll still get our good circle and a half circle if we were to see the inside of the bag. And it's gonna be very hard to see. Even if you came up to it and started giving it a little squish, it's not really gonna be connected at all. And at this point, we like to wait until that invisible circle, you can very briefly see it, gets about this big, or on our 4 pounds, it starts to take up about half of the face on one of the bags. From there, we shake the bag and then we just let it sit. And this is where it's just gonna start to fully take over the bag. After the shaking stage, you'll start noticing these white threads taking over the whole bag. And about a week after shaking, we're gonna have a fully myceliated bag, but it may not appear that way because it's still very wispy, it's still very thready. But if you come up to these bags and give them a little squish, there will be some firmness inside of there. So it won't just be like a loose bag of grain with some little bits, it'll actually start to be this nice, like, oh, okay, I understand why a brick is forming or how a brick is forming. And what we've noticed recently is that oats are doing a really good job for growing LionsMane on. We originally were using rye berries, but the oats are able to hold a little more moisture content, upper in about the 56% range, and the LionsMane just absolutely love this. And they'll take over the bag, and then unlike with rye berries or some other mixtures, they'll actually start to densen up and make like a really white, almost matte type of deal. We broke one up the other day and I had to double check if it was a LionsMane because it was almost looking like an oyster mushroom bag. And so yeah, only other really thing to note in that stage or to watch out for is if they start auto fruiting. And obviously they're a little more susceptible to mold early on just because they're not this nice thick mat. There's this kind of wispy mycelium throughout the bag. But once fully established and it's going, the main thing you have to watch out for is that it just auto fruits too much. We're okay with a little bit of auto fruiting to spawn with that because most Hericium species, if there's a little fruiting body, it'll just kind of melt back into mycelium. But we like to catch things before they've started fruiting or right before, if we have some of that firmness, we can deem it good to go. So about a week to get that nice circle and it's established in the grain bag, and then we shake it, and then about another week until it's fully taken over that bag, and maybe we're looking to refrigerate it so it doesn't auto fruit, or we're looking to spawn with it. So from one of these dishes doing our cuttings, if we're just doing 2 cuttings all around the dish, we like to max out at about 12 master bags. This just makes sure that we don't really skimp on any room and we still get the right size cuttings each time. And so if we're doing 4 cuttings per the bag, it makes about 6 4-pound masters. And so another thing to note on that moisture content is that the LionsMane, it'll kind of let you know if your moisture content's real low, kind of in those lower 40 realms. What we've seen in the past with when we've been growing it on other grains or experimenting is that if we don't have enough moisture and it is in that low 40 percentile range, the growth will be a lot slower. It'll be a lot more unhappy. And with that, right, we're increasing our chance of infection that's possible. And also, it'll just be so much slower and it won't actually try to densen up like we've noticed with the oats. It won't make that kind of nice, thick white strands. It'll always exist in this wispy stage. And also with that, since LionsMane is very reactive and doesn't like to be unhappy, you get a lot more chance for auto fruiting to happen. So we have that a lot more in our cases with lower moisture bags, was that the bag wouldn't even be fully myceliated yet, and you're already starting to see auto fruits in the little sections that have been myceliated. So we have our 4-pound grain master, and from that 1 4-pound grain master, we are gonna make 12 6-pound grain spawn bags. And we call them, we call it Agar, G1 and G2 because, generation 1, generation 2, or we also call our G1 master bags. So that 1 4-pound master makes our 12 6-pound grain bags. And with this, we don't like to go below 6 bags knocked per grain bag, just because then we're kind of adding a little bit too much and we might start getting weird growth inside of the bag, like this part's super old while over here just got colonized. And then we also don't like to go above 24 bags knocked per 4-pound grain master, as this we're just skimping it a little bit and now we're starting to stress the mycelium to reach out and grab all corners of that bag. So boom, knock your 12 bags, seal them all up, send them off to incubation, where they'll sit at about 65 to 70 degrees for a week and a half, 2 weeks. These are a very fast strain. They are almost on the same par with oysters in terms of their time frame. And inside of those grain bags, this bag is 7 days old, and it's got a little bit of firmness in there. It doesn't feel like quite a brick. You know, if I squeeze this, it would just all explode into a bunch of individual grain. But throughout the bag, we can see it's not just wispy. There's some wispiness that's covered the whole thing, but there are strands that are solid white and are starting to appear inside of the bag. Whereas when we first knock it, that first week, it's just gonna be kind of a loose bag of grain, and you'll maybe see some wispiness, but it's gonna exist in that kind of invisible wispy state for that entire first week. You can go up to the bag and, you know, if you go to move it around, it'll all just kind of jiggle in your hands instead of try to stay as a brick and connected. And then come that second week, that's when you'll start seeing the wispiness. Maybe, well, you'll just see the wispiness be a little more present. It won't necessarily be invisible. We'll actually start seeing some threads. They'll look a little thicker, and our bag will actually have some structure to it. Come the end of that 2 weeks is usually when we'll like to look to ship or move our bags over to cold storage. And inside of that cold storage, we usually, LionsMane will still try to fruit inside of a cold storage room. So we like to put them in there, but not keep them in there for no longer than 2 weeks. Obviously, this goes off of you know, whatever temperature you keep your cold room at, and with constant monitoring, just making sure that they don't auto fruit. But again, like with the 4-pound master, our main concern usually is too many auto fruits in the bag, because if the whole bag is covered in fruits and we go to spawn with it, it's not going to want to spread and take over the bag as easily. It'll have to switch all its genetics from fruiting bodies back to mycelium and spreading, and you'll just run into a lot of problems that way. From that, we are ready to spawn with this and make our substrate blocks.
Hello, mycological friends. I'd like to thank my co-host Gregor for his very astute, saged, and succinct summary of all things LionsMane, leading up to what I'll talk about, which is substrate blocks, their incubation, management, characteristics, all that, and fruiting them, fruiting practices, for the Leighton Banks strain of LionsMane, which we have co-opted. We have a whole made-up story about how we cloned this from the wild woods of Gardner and dubbed it the CapNStem strain, but don't listen to our lies. It's the Leighton Banks strain. As far as inoculations of fruiting substrate, if we're talking about sort of the standard, if you will, of using master's mix, a 10-pound block, and in our case, using a 6-pound bag of G2 grain spawn. Our standard is 20 10-pound blocks from every 6-pound G2. That amounts to about 1/3 of a pound of grain in the bag itself. Now, there is a range that makes sense depending on your circumstances. With the Leighton strain, I would say that you wouldn't want to go too far below about 12 blocks per 6-pound bag, so as not to just basically overload what is already a very rich growing medium with grain, which is a powerful supplement in its own right. And I also wouldn't recommend going above about 30 blocks. At that point, the risks of mold creeping in gonna creep up. The lion's mane's a fickle strain and it's easily tampered with. Early on, the latent strain, like most lions, is very faint. The untrained eye, you might not see much biological activity whatsoever. However, it still runs quite fast. And the overall timeline for it to reach full incubation, it's on par with most of the faster strains like oysters. At first, you can hardly see a thing. It's a very wispy mycelium. You just sort of see a slight opaque discoloration of the growing medium developing. As a sidebar, that can make it tricky at times to differentiate between healthy Hericium mycelium and something that is not that, that's inside your block. We've had times where there's been, for example, trichoderma that's still in its asexual phase, wreaking havoc on a portion of the substrate, and it's ever so slightly has a different growth pattern, a little bit more of a dense matting growth, and ever so slightly a different shade of off-white, but very hard to differentiate from healthy Hericium mycelium because the trichoderma has yet to reproduce and shoot out spores, at which point it's pretty damn obvious to see it's green. As Hericium matures, it becomes a little bit more obvious as exhibited on this mature block that's ready to be fruited, and it is indeed solid and dense. Once Hericium blocks have reached maturity, they don't take long to start to prepare to fruit mushrooms. What they first will do is start to shoot up a mat of aerial mycelium. You'll often see this on the top surface of the block. If you have ambient lighting in your incubation room, that's where it's gonna pop up. If you had a bag that's super slanted, if your bag wasn't, tight to the substrate, you might see primordia beginning to form in some of those nooks and crannies. But for the most part, you're gonna see a slowly developing aerial pillow of marshmallowy mycelium start to coat the top surface that will indeed mature to full-fledged lion's mane fruits. That will get denser and denser and look more recognizable as baby mushrooms the longer it sits. But basically, as soon as you start to see that pillow of aerial mycelium coat the top surface of your block, that's a good shorthand reference to know that it is ready to be brought into the fruit room. The latent bank strain is pretty rapid as mentioned, despite its wispy nature. We typically plan in our incubation scheduling for 12 days for it to be completely ready to be boxed up and shipped to a farm for fruiting. You have a little bit more of a grace period with Substrate in general, but with lion's mane, depending on the particulars, your spawning rate, ambient temp, recipe, genetics, you can expect something between 10 days if you're a speed demon. And it's relatively stable and fine to fruit with basically the same outcomes well beyond that point of 12 days, something like 16, 17, 18 days, and it's still gonna be at a point where that primordial mat at the top hasn't developed so far that it makes your fruiting complicated. Once you are ready to fruit this very vigorous latent banks lion's mane block, you have a few different options. They generally all involve cutting the bag as long as what you're going after is a typical recognizable lion's mane fruit. Sidebar, if all you cared about was just mass because you were processing it for tinctures or something like that, you could just let it fruit in vitro, set it and forget it, a la growing reishi antlers, without care for it looking like a big pillowy mass of marshmallows. But assuming you're trying to fruit these to form healthy looking lion's mane fruits, you're gonna be making a cut in all intents and purposes. Most folks at least see the merit in working with the natural tendency of lion's mane to start to fruit in the plenum of the bag. And for that reason, the ideal oftentimes is to intercept this bag from its incubation right when it's formed that pillowy mass, but before they've kind of matured to recognizable fruits. Cut the bag and then cut a slit across the top surface of the block. Not too deep, just a nice long slit, sometimes with a cross is fine as well. At the same time, plenty of folks will cut on the long side of the bags, the fat side of the bags, etc. But basically you're just going after your standard slit cut or X cut, like a lot of other varieties such as blue oyster. LionsMane has a relatively wide tolerance for different fruiting temperatures. One thing that most folks will see, and have probably had some experience with, is Hericiums in general tend not to do so well if it gets too hot for their liking, and that extends to fruiting. In really hot environments, they're a little bit more prone to having bacterial infections, and it's a little bit trickier to manage other environmental variables that interact with temperature, like relative humidity and fresh air exchange. But generally speaking, somewhere in the 55 to 65 Fahrenheit range is kind of the ideal for the latent bank strain. It is indeed a strain compared to other LionsManes, such as POW, that does prefer it ever so slightly on the cooler side, might not perform as well as it gets warmer. Somewhere in around 60 degrees seems to be the sweet spot in my personal experience. LionsMane definitely don't do well if one of the environmental variables in your fruiting room is off or inconsistent. That's where you'll often see sort of a popcorny cauliflower-like formation on them. As far as relative humidity is concerned, like it a little bit more moderate. Oftentimes folks will say slightly lower than what they're maintaining for oysters. What you'll see with exceedingly high relative humidity, if basically there's very little chance for moisture to wick off the developing fruits, that's where you'll often get uneven spine development and overall a fruit that looks like it has different chunks at different stages of development and big nasty ass spines drooping down on one side and a dense ball without any expression to it on the other half of the fruit. People tend to operate a little bit lower with relative humidity. I've often seen somewhere in the upper 80s to very low 90s as a recommendation. We've often heard too, people emphasizing a relative humidity swing for LionsMane as being really beneficial for even fruit body development and getting basically a smooth surface to the block where there aren't those crenulations like the craters of the moon, and the spines develop at a relatively consistent rate. As far as air exchanges are concerned, LionsMane and the latent bank strain is definitely one that won't do so well if there's insufficient fresh air exchange and or excessive CO2. Excessive CO2, whether that's because the room's hot and the blocks are respiring at a faster rate, or if it's just densely packed, you're just loading in blocks, they're pressed up right against each other. Point being, if these are having a hard time getting a constantly replenished supply of fresh air with high oxygen, you'll often see a lot of those same problems with unhealthy looking fruit body development. Our general recommendation does tend to apply having your CO2 evac fan programmed to start flushing out once you exceed about 800 or so parts per million of CO2 until you get back down to baseline atmospheric CO2 levels in the 450 range. As far as lighting regimes in the fruit room are concerned, LionsMane is most certainly a fairly heavily light-triggered species. I'm not aware of folks who do a super precise lighting regime. It's not as light dependent as other varieties such as Maitake, but it definitely is encouraged for a more robust pin set and fruiting overall with solid ambient, all spectrum lighting. LionsMane is certainly a slower growing variety in the fruit room compared to some others. Not absurdly long, but in your typical low 60s fruiting environment with this particular strain, the primordia are relatively slow to develop. They take a long time to swell up in size to their max potential mass, after which you should ideally see even spine development as those spines elongate, giving you that cue that they are getting ready to harvest. The latent strain is known for very dense fruits. Overall, they just have a shitload of mass to them, very dense, and their spines tend not to swell up to quite the same size as many other strains, and particularly compared to wild LionsMane. And furthermore, they tend not to form that classic drooping down effect that you'll see with a lot of hericiums. They tend to just have very small spines, which is a nice quality for a lot of folks because it makes them kind of easier to handle and hold up after harvesting. Overall, I would say that on average, you're looking at 14 to 20 days or so until harvest for LionsMane. Be careful when you're harvesting them too, because they're very prone to bruising. They have very soft tissue. They can hold quite a bit of water in them, and you can easily kind of tarnish the quality of your fruits by poor handling practices. Yeah, thanks for checking out this Pheno Flicks, filmed on a beautiful day here in Gardner, Maine in late summer. Stay tuned for the next bit of content from Myco Wizards. Oh yeah, this way, yeah. Okay.